Welcome. You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast, the show that cuts through the fog of war and updates you about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Marina Yevshan, your host of the Russia-Ukraine War Report podcast, and today is September the 18th, 2024. It has been 3,887 days since Russia started covert military operations in Crimea, 10 years and 210 days since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, 2 years and 207 days since Russia expanded its war of aggression, and 44 days since Ukraine counter-invaded Russia. Today's podcast covers the events that happened on Tuesday and Wednesday morning. You will find the Russia-Ukraine war map helpful to visualize the areas discussed. There is a link in the podcast description and the RAM-up updates today. The Russia-Ukraine War Report is compiled by our team from around the world. Today's report includes information from our direct contacts and journalists in Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine morning reports, operational commands north, south, and east of Ukraine, open source intelligence, our in-house team of analysts and geospatial experts, and pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian mail bloggers and social media channels with a track record of trying to be accurate. We have one mission: the truth, because the truth matters. Here is my daily assessment. 1. It is highly likely United States military aid to Ukraine will end on September 30th, 2024, beyond already committed deliveries and funding, and will not be readdressed until February 2025. 2. We maintain that the loss of assistance from the United States has the potential to be catastrophic for the Ukrainian armed forces. 3. The lack of leadership by the United States risks starting a global arms race as countries re-evaluate their political relationships and seek to secure their national security through their own means. 4. The lack of a meaningful response by Ukraine's allies and international organizations to open and unrestricted attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russia has convinced Moscow this is an effective strategy with no political consequences. 5. Russia will maintain its attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, continuing Russian crimes against humanity that started in October 2022. As outlined in 4 arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. 6. The continued attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have caused critical damage, creating an environment where an accident at one or more of Ukraine's nuclear power plants is possible. 7. The policy of escalation management implemented by the NATO alliance and the United States is a complete failure that has only encouraged Russia to escalate hybrid and kinetic warfare actions against the NATO alliance and Ukraine's allies and their economic interests. 8. The failed policies of the NATO alliance are increasing the probability of nuclear proliferation and an expansion of the Russia-Ukraine war into the European continent. 9. While Russian forces continue to make gains, we assess that it will be difficult to maintain the current operational tempo due to unsustainable losses of heavy equipment and personnel. 10. We maintain the Kursk counter-invasion is strategically sound. 11. Autocrat Vladimir Putin's order to recapture the Kursk region of Russia by October 1st is unrealistic and extremely unlikely. 12. The Russian economy is much weaker than reported. 13. We maintain the world is caught in the mutually assured destruction instability paradox. Today, we start with the action report summary. Yesterday, Russia carried out 194 discrete assaults, and through September 17th, the 7-day moving average for daily attacks jumped to 154. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, or GSAFU, only released a partial report on airstrikes and artillery activity. The VKS, that's the Russian Aerospace Forces, carried out at least 59 airstrikes, dropping 84 bombs, and Russian ground units carried out over 3,400 fire missions. In the Kursk region, Ukraine controls 1,056 square kilometers, with another 329.5 in the grey zone, for a total area of 1,385.5 square kilometers. There are two breaches. The first, from Nikolaeva-Daryina to Kucherov, is 70 kilometers wide, and the second, at Novy Put, is 22 kilometers. Ukrainian forces are up to 26 kilometers in depth from the main breach at Sudzha and up to 5.5 kilometers deep from the second breach at Novy Put. Ukraine controls 83 hamlets, villages and settlements, including important infrastructure facilities such as the Sudzha gas metering facility. Of those, 27 are under administrative control of the provisional government. Let's go into the details of what happened on the battlefield. This would be a good time to open up the war map on a second device and find the city of Sumy, that's in northeastern Ukraine. There is a link to the map in the podcast description. Ready? Here we go. We begin in the Kursk region of Russia, in the Glushkovo area of operation, or AO. Russian sources shared a video of a Ukrainian Cossack 2 M1 infantry mobility vehicle destroyed on the eastern edge of Volfina. The IFV was heading east when it was attacked, confirming that Ukraine successfully breached the Russian border at Krasnooktyabrskyi and advanced into the eastern part of Volfina, establishing a second ground line of communication, or GLOC, that's a supply line, to Veselaya. In Veselaya, fighting continued in the southeastern part of the settlement. A Ukrainian drone destroyed a potentially abandoned Russian tank on the western edge of Sadove Tovarishchestvo Glushkovo. New video was released by Ukraine that showed another area where a border breach occurred west of Medvezhye, with tanks attacking a Russian strongpoint. The Russian Ministry of Defense, or Armad, reported fighting continued in the area of the village. In the Korenevo AO, Ukrainian forces used a Dragon drone on a tree line occupied by Russian forces west of Nikolaeva-Daryina, confirming a new advance of up to 2,000 meters. The map was adjusted. Multiple Russian sources reported there were no other significant changes to the line of conflict. A Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle deployed dismounts northwest of Lyubimovka, 1,000 meters north from where we assessed Ukrainian forces hold control. A drone destroyed the BMP-2, and the dismounts were forced to run across open fields right into the Ukrainian defenses. The failed assault confirmed that Russian forces no longer occupy the forested region between Lyubimovka and Korenevo village. Further north, significant fighting continued north of Olgovka and in the area of Vetrina and Matveyevka, with no significant change in the situation. At Kremyana, there were no credible reports of fighting. In the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine, Russia attacked the city of Sumy with 4 unspecified missiles targeting critical civilian infrastructure. Part of the Him-Mestechko district lost power and water after the attack. War correspondent Alona Yatsina with Radio Liberty, a United States state media agency, reported, quote, "I drove around the city and several traffic lights are working. There is no electricity and no communication service. Water is supplied more or less normally up to the 4th floor, but with reduced pressure. Trolley buses are not running. As far as we know, people have not been injured." Another missile strike targeted a business in northeastern Sumy, wounding a 41-year-old man. At the time of recording, no other information was available. The Sumy Oblast Prosecutor's Office reported that Glushkovo was hit by 3 glide bombs, killing 2 men aged 34 and 64. The bombing destroyed and damaged 20 civilian homes. It's time to talk about my home, Ukraine. Beginning in the Kharkiv Oblast in the Liptsev-Ovchansk AO, Russian forces made marginal gains in Gluboke while coming under attack by drones. Positional fighting continued in Vovchansk. In the Kupiansk AO, Russian attempts to retake lost positions in Sinkivka and advance in the direction of Petropavlivka, Novoosinovo, Kruglякivka, Kolesnikivka and Lozova ended in failure. In the Luhansk Oblast, west of occupied Svatove, Russian forces made a small advance northeast of Stelmachivka, with their new position attacked by a Dragon drone. Russian attempts to advance toward Novoyegorivka from Sergeyivka and in the direction of Druzhelyubivka from Novovodane were unsuccessful. West of Kremenna, fighting continued in Makiyivka and east of Nevske, with no change in the situation. Northeast of Torske, Ukrainian forces advanced up to 500 meters. Next up, the Donbass, where we start in the northeastern part of the Donetsk Oblast. Beginning in the Siversk AO, Russian forces only launched one attack on Zolotarivka and a second southeast of Vyimka. In the Kostantinivka AO, there were no new Russian advances reported, with fighting reported at the Siversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal in Kalinivka and the canal district of Chasiv Yar, east of Stupochki, in southern Klishchiivka and on the western edge of Kurdyumivka. In the Toretsk-New York AO, Ukrainian forces also held their defensive lines. From Druzhba, Russian forces tried to advance in the direction of Dachne using the railroad grade. Fighting continued in eastern Toretsk and southwestern Zalizne, where Russian forces continued their efforts to advance toward Nelipivka and in the direction of Sherbynivka. In southwestern Donetsk Oblast, intense fighting continued in the Pokrovsk AO, where Russian forces carried out 51 assaults. There was a small advance of 400 meters north of Arkhangelsk, with Russian forces taking a wounded Ukrainian soldier prisoner. Russian forces made significant advances in Hrodivka, reaching the northern part of the settlement. A second video showed a potential advance into the western part of Hrodivka, but it was unclear which combatant was under fire. Out of an abundance of caution, the grey area was expanded. Intense fighting continued in Novohrodivka, Marinivka and Mikhailivka, where Russian forces made no new advances. It was a similar situation in the Kurakhove AO, where Russian forces were able to make new gains. In Ukrainsk, Russian forces raised two flags in the northern and southern parts of the settlement, with the mining waste heap to the west still occupied by Ukrainian forces. From southern Ukrainsk, Russian forces attempted to advance in the direction of Tsukurine and Girnik without success, and fighting continued in the northern part of Zhelanne Persha. If you're wondering about Nevelske, every time I bring it up, I'm told to make an edit to the podcast because something changes. According to the best intelligence we have, Ukrainian forces still hold part of Nevelske. Russian attacks in the direction of Alexandropol, that's the one near Kurakhove, were repulsed, and Ukrainian forces held their defensive lines in Maximilianivka. Supported by the VKS, Russian troops continued their attacks in the Kostantinivka area with no change in the situation. In the Vuhledar AO, fighting continued at Pivdenno-Donbaska coal mine number 1 and number 3. Russian forces also maintained pressure on Ukrainian defensive positions east and south of Vuhledar. Insurgents shared pictures of one of the destroyed ammunition depots near Mariupol, and satellite images from Planet Labs confirmed 2 depots were destroyed in separate attacks over the last week. The depot located near Malekene turned a large area into a barren wasteland, with burned-out artillery shells scattered across the area. We'll link to the pictures in today's situation report. There's more information in the podcast description on how to become a subscriber. In the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, there was an increase in activity. In the Gulyapolo AO, Russian forces carried out 2 assaults, one from Dorozhnyanka and the other from the Marfopil area, suffered losses and retreated to their defensive positions. In the Orikhovo, Russian forces carried out 8 assaults, with fighting reported near Mala Tokmachka, Nesteryanka and south of Shcherbaky. There were no changes in the situation.
You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War Podcast. Our team of journalists, researchers and analysts is funded by readers, listeners and viewers just like you. To support independent journalism, please consider becoming a patron. You can find us on patreon.com/malcontentnews.
It was a big night in Russia, with Russian sources claiming Ukraine launched over 100 drones targeting military facilities and infrastructure. In the Tver region, Ukrainian drones struck the 107th Main Missile and Artillery Directorate ammunition depot in Tarapets, over 475 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. In addition to open-air storage, the 8-square-kilometer facility has at least 41 modern bunkers built in 2018 and over 70 above-ground storage sheds. Each bunker holds up to 240 metric tons of ammunition, and the facility is capable of storing over 30,000 tons of explosive ordnance. You can thank bad Russian operational security in 2018 and 2022 for providing that information. In 2018, then Russian Deputy Defense Minister Dmitry Bulgakov boasted that the new ammunition bunkers meet, quote, the highest world standards. In 2022, the Kremlin said, quote, the arsenal allows us to protect stockpiles of missiles and ammunition from external influences and ensure their safety. Those boasts aged like room-temperature milk. Initially, the Russian government made its standard claim that all drones were shot down, but debris landed in the area. A video showed that the sprawling facility was hit in at least 3 locations, with a massive explosion sending out a visible shockwave. After the blast, rockets were visibly cooking off and launching in multiple directions. Hours later, a video recorded over 4 kilometers away captured an explosion where large rockets with unitary warheads cooked off, causing visible secondary explosions across the horizon. The size of the explosions and the lack of a fireworks appearance strongly suggest that Iskander-M or North Korean KN-23 short-range ballistic missiles were stored at the site. NASA fire information for resource management systems showed the entire facility was on fire, including the areas where the newer bunkers are located. A resident published a video from the shore of Lake Kudinskaya, confirming the satellite intelligence and capturing the sound of ammunition cooking off. Smoke was rising thousands of meters into the air. From the same location, a picture showed another explosion that is consistent with air defense missiles cooking off. The fire is so massive it created pyrocumulus clouds that are visible from space. At the time of recording, 18 explosions were large enough to be detected by earthquake monitors in Estonia and Ukraine, registering from 2.0 to 2.8 on the Richter scale, with the largest occurring just before 4 in the morning Moscow time. These are roughly the same magnitude caused by the 2 2015 explosions in Tianjin, China, which registered 2.3 and 2.9. A mandatory evacuation of Tarapets, with a population of 11,000, and the surrounding villages was ordered. Residents were told they would receive no support and would have to self-evacuate, and the first pictures and videos appearing after sunrise showed windows and doors blown out across the settlement. On Russia's Facebook clone, VK, there was an appeal for a water rescue for the residents of Tsikhareva, located just 1.5 kilometers away. Another resident claimed, quote, "Tsikhareva has already burned down," unquote, adding that the Ministry of Emergency Situations would be sending boats. Homes and schools 5 kilometers away in Talitsa had entire window frames blown out and roof damage from the repeated shock waves. Russian officials reported that 17 were injured, but the number is expected to rise significantly. Geospatial intelligence indicated that due to rockets and air defense missiles cooking off, fires had potentially spread into northeastern Tarapets and the villages of Kolodina, Zarechная, Kudina, the previously mentioned Tsikhareva, Gorodok, Vasilyeva, east of Borodashkina, and the forests southeast of the depot. On the Telegram channel Overheard Tarapets, one resident wrote, quote, "For what? For what, bitches? We just lived, and now we've become homeless. My house disappeared near the military units. Tarapets residents, dear ones, hold on all." For what? You're asking for what? Your houses are destroyed? Color me shocked. Earlier in the podcast, Malekina was mentioned. That's a resort place by the Sea of Azov, which I visited as a child during my summer holidays. It is turned into barren wasteland because of Russia. Kurakhove, that's also a place from my childhood memories. That's where I caught a fish for the first time in my life. Selidove, Ocheretine, Grodivka. Some talented children lived there who I met during various competitions in my school years. No more talented children there, no more school competitions. And in yesterday's podcast, we were talking about Mr. Hymas visiting Russian training base on the western outskirts of the city of Donetsk. I know that place. My wedding ceremony and reception was in the vicinity. Everything I cherish is destroyed or poisoned by Russia. And that's only a humble example of one person. Don't ask for what, dear Russian. You know exactly for what. Do you want it to stop? Go home, leave Ukraine completely, and it ends. The ammunition depot had its own railroad yard, which is only 1.2 kilometers from the strategically important railroad yards in Tarapets, a critical logistics node for Russia's task group North. The line is so critical for Russian military logistics that on August the 12th, Russian Railways announced all non-military cargo traffic between Belarus from Orsha and Vitebsk to Smolensk was banned due to shortages in staff and operational locomotives. One of the key areas supported by Tarapets, Russian forces defending the Kursk region. At the time of publication, ammunition was still cooking off. And even after the destruction of the depot, Russian officials got in front of the cameras and declared that no drones hit the ammunition depot, and the fire was caused by falling debris. The statement was made to the chorus of ammunition cooking off in the distance. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov called for Russian mail bloggers and propagandists not to post videos of the burning arsenal in Tarapets, since this will play, quote, into the hands of the enemy. First, who's going to tell him that videos and pictures are already circulating around the world? Second, who is going to tell him that you can see the explosion from outer space? And here is the cherry on top. After the attack, Ukrainian hackers locked Russian officials out of the Tarapets public website, naming the Defense Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine head Kyrylo Budanov as the mayor. A screenshot of the website is in today's situation report. You'll find a link in the podcast description. Near the city of Saratov, high-resolution satellite images from Planet Labs shared by Radio Liberty show that Ukrainian drones struck Engels military airfield on September the 16th, but missed critical targets and only caused grass fires. Estonia President Alar Karis called for Russia to be defeated and for the NATO alliance to do more to support Ukraine. Quote, Probably some countries and some leaders are afraid of escalation. There is no escalation anymore. Russia has crossed all red lines already. There is no point in being afraid of escalation. These restrictions are just pointless. Karis added that Estonia, Europe and the NATO alliance are on the side of democracy that, quote, should do much more. Honoring the dead of the Second World War on the 85th anniversary of the Soviet Union's invasion of Poland in alliance with Nazi Germany, Polish President Andrzej Duda compared the geopolitical situation of today to 1939. Saying that history has shown, whether it was the Tsarists of the Russian Imperial Empire, the Soviets, or the Russian Federation ruled by autocrat Vladimir Putin, quote, it is all the same terrible monster. It is the same Russian model of colonialism, domination over other peoples, seizing their territory, natural resources, exploiting them, enslaving them, imposing their ideology, imposing what they call Ruski Mir, which we do not want. Vowing to continue support for Ukraine, Duda said that the Polish people have and will stand in defense of, quote, those who are defending themselves from Russian domination. Dozens of government officials and at least one college professor signed a letter sent to United States President Joe Biden, appealing for more support for Ukraine. Quote, the time for action is now. The coming weeks are crucial, and we implore you to lift the restrictions on weapons that will allow Ukraine to strike back at all legitimate military targets inside Russia. The world's democracies look to the United States to lead in times of crisis. Please help us help Ukraine. Most of the signatories were from nations that would be next in line to be invaded by Russia if aid to Ukraine continues to be restricted or, worse, ends. Journalist Alex Raufoglu once again pressed United States Department of State spokesperson Matthew Miller on the continued impasse on allowing Ukraine to strike Russia and the trickle of military aid sent in 2024. Here is Mr. Miller.
We expect them to win by continuing to provide them the billions of dollars in security assistance that we have provided them since the outset of this conflict, the type of security assistance that, along with brave Ukrainian fighting, has led them to recapture a majority of the territory that they lost to Ukraine in the early days of the war. Lost to Russia, excuse me, thank you, Matt. That they lost to Russia in the early days of the war, the capabilities that have led them to win the battles of Kyiv and Kharkiv and Kherson, and have led them to push Russia back from the Black Sea. Those are the types of policies that have shown success that we will continue to pursue.
I think my head just exploded. When Ukraine launched the Kyiv counteroffensive, the United States had only provided $30 million of anti-tank Javelin missiles. The rest of the almost $1.5 billion in aid received from 2014 through 2021 was for training, intelligence and surveillance support and non-lethal military aid. 2 days after Russia expanded its war of aggression against Ukraine, Washington's reaction was not to provide military support, but to offer to evacuate President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky and leave Ukraine to the Russians. Most of the military aid provided in the spring and summer of 2022 was to equip Ukraine to fight a guerrilla war under the assumption that Russia would occupy the country. Calls to send fighter airplanes, armored vehicles, tanks and air defense systems beyond manpads started in March 2022, with Poland ready to transfer its entire fleet of MiG-29s. Washington rejected all of these efforts. The first M777 howitzers didn't reach the field in Ukraine until May 2022, and the first M142 GMLRS, better known as HIMARS, arrived at the end of June. The Kherson counteroffensive started in July, and the Kharkiv counteroffensive started in September. Miller's response was stunningly tone-deaf, highlighting 3 Ukrainian victories from 2 years ago when United States aid was still relatively limited. Even during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Kyiv appealed for ATACMS missiles to destroy the bridges to the right bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson Oblast. Instead, Ukraine was forced to use hundreds of rockets, which would be indispensable today. We deeply appreciate United States aid, but it's not 2022 anymore. The Financial Times reported that the European Union is prepared to move forward on a military financial aid package of up to $40 billion with or without the United States. A plan on how to leverage frozen Russian assets by the G7, led by the US, to provide Ukraine with $50 billion remains in limbo. Initially, it was planned that the EU with the US would each provide $20 billion, with the remaining $10 billion to be split between the UK, Japan and Canada. Those funds would be backed by almost $300 million in frozen Russian assets. Most of those funds are in European banks. Washington is concerned that Hungary could take action to torpedo the deal and wants additional guarantees. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is allegedly working to stall the deal, waiting to learn the outcome of the upcoming federal elections in the US. Brussels is under pressure to complete all the details by the end of October, so the financial package can be transferred by the end of 2024. Otherwise, the entire process is back to square one. The US publication, The Economist, warned that the United States has, quote, Stockholm Syndrome, with advisors within the Biden administration still clinging to the hope that the relationship with the Russian Federation and autocrat Putin can be normalized. Within the circle of Russian support, within the Department of Defense, the National Security Council and the State Department, they aren't worried about nuclear escalation, but an unrestorable relationship with Moscow if restrictions on weapons used by Ukraine are lifted. There has been no action by Congress to extend the unused Presidential Drawdown Authority funds, almost $6 billion, which will expire on September 30th. One of the reasons the White House has provided only a trickle of aid since April 2024 is the lack of corresponding funds in the Pentagon budget to replace the materials and equipment sent to Ukraine. While President Joe Biden can draw down US stockpiles below the legal minimums in the interest of national security, there is strong opposition within the Department of Defense. Without additional funding for the Pentagon in the 2025 budget, which won't be passed before the November elections, Washington's hands are essentially tied. Kyiv submitted its victory plan to the United States, according to Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations. Thomas-Greenfield said the initial reaction was positive and the plan was realistic, adding, quote, "We need to understand how we can contribute to its implementation by communicating with all the heads of state who will be here in New York. We hope to make progress." The UN General Assembly will meet on September the 25th. The Netherlands reported that its effort to create a Patriot air defense battery with multiple nations collapsed, with an unnamed nation backing out. Ukraine was provided with a radar system, but no additional launchers or a command vehicle. Italy promised that it would deliver another SAMP-T air defense system to Ukraine by the end of September. And that's what we know. Your support of my home, Ukraine, helps us make history and protect the future for all.
You've been listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast. To help keep us independent, please consider providing financial support by becoming a patron. Want on-demand news in your hand? Download the Google News app and make Malcontent News one of your favorites to receive breaking news updates. Thank you for listening.